All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those of you listening in various time zones or at a later time. I'd like to welcome you to the National Public Scoping webinar on defining the scope of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. My name is Eric Kershner. I'm the branch chief for the Conservation Permits and Regulations branch within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Migratory Bird Program. And I'll be your presenter today. I'm also accompanied by additional U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service staff and also Office of the Solicitor within the Department of Interior. We operate out of our headquarters in Falls Church, Virginia. Also with me today is staff from DJ Case who are helping us manage and present these webinars. I'd like to thank them for all their hard work to bring this information to you today, and I'd also like to thank you, the webinar participants, for your time and involvement in the public scoping process. With that, I'll start up the presentation. Right now, you should be viewing a white title screen for this presentation. Let's stay here for a moment to allow a few additional folks to be admitted to the webinar. All right. Before we get started, I want to point out how to communicate with us during this webinar. Your cameras and mic controls will be restricted during this meeting. In other words, we cannot see or hear you, but you can see and hear me. However, you will have an opportunity to ask questions, so I want to share with you how to do that when we get to the end of this presentation, and we'll prompt listeners to submit questions by using the chat feature in the webinar controls. This should appear if you, the question feature, sorry. This should appear if you hover your mouse over the pointer over the bottom of the screen as pictured here. Control panel should be showing you a chat icon question that you can click on, and a panel will be up to the side. You can ask your question in that window. Okay, let's take a look at what we'll be going over to today. First, I'll discuss the services responsibilities under the National Environmental Policy Act. I'll then provide a brief overview of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. I'll discuss the change in interpretation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that occurred in 2017. Then I'll present the purpose and need for changing the scope of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. I'll then provide an overview of the proposed alternatives to meet the stated purpose and need. And finally, I'll let you know how you can participate in this process and have your voice heard on our proposal. I wanted to start with the services responsibility under the National Environmental Policy Act. NEPA requires federal agencies to analyze environmental impacts of federal actions and requires federal agencies to engage the public in our decision-making process. NEPA will also require us to prepare an environmental impact statement for actions that could significantly affect the quality of the human environment. Right now, we're in the middle of a public scoping for this proposed action. This scoping period is an opportunity for the public to provide input on the purpose and need for clarifying the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, issues and topics we should be analyzing in the NEPA document, alternatives we should consider that we may not have specified, sources of information we should consider, and any other relevant information. This comment period runs through March 9th, and you can provide comments at any time during this step. I will talk later about specific information the service is seeking from the public. So let's get into the proposed action. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act is one of the oldest environmental laws on the books. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, migratory birds faced an onslaught of threats from unregulated hunting for commercial use, primarily for food and the millinery trade, the feather industry. Records indicate that over 2 million birds per year were being killed for the feathered hat trade, primarily wading birds such as herons and egrets. During this time, many species were on the brink of extinction, and some notable species such as the passenger pigeon and Carolina parakeet did go extinct. As a response to the extinction of the passenger pigeon, a treaty was entered into between Great Britain for Canada for our shared migratory bird resources. The goal of this treaty was to reduce the unregulated hunting of birds and eggs. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act was passed in 1918 to implement the treaty with Canada. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act is responsible for bringing many species of migratory birds back from the brink of extinction to the point where millions of Americans can enjoy hunting and bird watching, contributing billions of dollars to the nation's economy. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act prohibits the taking of migratory birds unless authorized by the Secretary of the Interior. In 1916 and 1918, the drafters of the Canada Treaty and the MBTA had the foresight to include a system of permits to authorize the intentional take of migratory birds as long as the take is compatible with the Migratory Bird Conventions. In December 2017, the Department of Interior Office of the Solicitor released an M opinion. The M opinion was issued to clarify that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act does not prohibit activities that result in the incidental take of migratory birds. By take, we mean to pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect, or attempt any of these actions with the intent of taking migratory birds, nests, or eggs. While it is true that the United States government interpreted the MBTA to apply to incidental take prior to the release of the M opinion, the department concluded this is not the correct interpretation. The Interior Solicitor provides detailed analysis of this conclusion in the M opinion, including the MBTA's prohibitions do not explicitly include incidental take, although Congress has amended the MBTA several times to address provisions that do I have a problem. To comply with the bilateral treaties, and for other reasons, it has not further clarified that the take has, my script is gone. Has further clarified that take has greater meaning than it is in common law, and federal courts are split on this question under the MBTA. We would like to communicate the purpose and need for the proposing action. The purpose in NEPA is a broad statement of goals that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service intends to fulfill by taking action. The need is the answer to the question, why is this action being taken at this time? The purpose of this action is to provide an official regulatory definition of the scope of the statute as it relates to incidental take. The service needs to conduct this action to improve consistency and enforcement of the MBTA's prohibitions across the country and thereby eliminate public uncertainty caused by the patchwork of legal standards across the different circuit courts of appeal, which have reached different conclusions on the central question on whether the MBTA prohibits incidental take. This approach aligns with and implements the department's interpretation of the MBTA M opinion. This is important to note because it drives the reasoning behind the proposed actions. I now want to talk about the proposed alternatives for the draft EIS analysis of the proposed action. NEPA requires that a federal agency consider a reasonable range of alternatives for consideration, including the no action alternative. Reasonable alternatives must be economically and technically feasible, display common sense, and must address the purpose and need for the action. The alternatives may not always be the easiest, cheapest, or fastest solutions. The service is proposing a no action alternative and 3 action alternatives. The no action alternative is essentially the status quo of how the service is currently implementing M opinion 37050. This means that we would rely on the M opinion to define the scope of the MBTA, which means that we would only enforce prohibitions on purposeful actions where the intent is to take migratory birds. As mentioned previously, the service intends to analyze 3 action alternatives. These action alternatives describe various approaches that the service could take to provide regulatory certainty regarding the incidental take of migratory birds. The intent of this analysis is to provide decision makers with a meaningful range of alternatives to foster informed decision-making and public participation. Action alternative A is to promulgate regulations to define the scope of the MBTA. The scope of the MBTA would be defined to prohibit actions directed at migratory birds. This action would not change the current implementation or enforcement of the MBTA that has been in place since December 22nd, 2017 M opinion. Action alternative B would analyze the development of a permit system to regulate incidental take. This alternative would establish a framework under which permits would be issued to provide legal coverage for the incidental take of migratory birds. To implement this alternative, the service would rescind the M opinion and develop a permit system to issue authorizations for incidental take resulting from otherwise legal actions. Action alternative C would analyze the development of an enforcement system to address gross negligence. Under this alternative, the Office of the Solicitor would rescind the M opinion, and the service would work to promulgate regulations to define the scope of the MBTA with a framework defining the standard under which service law enforcement could take action when the take of migratory birds is the consequence of gross negligence. Gross negligence is defined as carelessness and reckless disregard of the consequences of an action, which is so great it appears to be a conscious violation, especially when a reasonable person should have anticipated and guarded against it. So we're currently in the early processes of drafting an EIS. The public scoping comment period is open through March 19th, and there are additional webinars that will be provided this week, and you can find that information on the webpage for further details. As far as a timetable, once the scoping period is closed, we will be reviewing and addressing comments and moving forward with the development of the draft EIS with a rough estimate for completion of spring of 2020. This draft EIS will be open for additional public input, and a final EIS and record of decision is planned for fall of 2020. As many of you are aware, at the same time the service published the notice of intent regarding the EIS, we published a proposed rule. In the interest of providing greater clarity regarding how these two pieces fit, I wanted to provide the timeline for the rulemaking efforts. The timeline to comment on the proposed rule is the same as the notice of intent, March 19th, 2020. And based on public input on the NOI and draft EIS and record decision, a final rule is planned for fall of 2020. You can follow this process and stay involved by following this website, which we will continue to update as process progresses. As a reminder, in this phase, you can provide comments up to March 19th by submitting them electronically in the federal e-rulemaking portal website provided here, or by hard copy to the address here. We do not accept email or faxes as official comments. All official comment will continue to be available on the e-rulemaking portal. And I'm going to take a moment here to stay on this slide so that if you want to write down the web page or any of the other information. Okay, to better complete the analysis of alternatives, the service is seeking specific information. If you have any information you would like to share on any of the following topics, please submit this information with your formal comments. We are seeking information on the avoidance and minimization and mitigation measures entities employed to address incidental take of migratory birds prior to the December 2017 M opinion, the direct costs associated with implementing these measures, the indirect costs that entities have incurred related to the legal risk of prosecution for incidental take of migratory birds, such as legal fees, increased interest rates on financing, insurance costs, or other opportunity costs. And the extent that avoidance, minimization, and mitigation measures continue to be used after the December 2017 M opinion. We're also seeking information on any quantitative information regarding the economic benefits and/or ecosystem services, such as pollination or pest control, provided by migratory birds, information regarding resources that may be impacted by the proposal, and finally, species that having religious or cultural significance for tribes and species having cultural significance for the general public and impacts to cultural values from the actions being considered. That concludes the presentation. At this time, I will try to address questions from the webinar participants. I want to remind you that your phones will continue to be muted, so please use the questions feature on the webinar menu. As we go through any questions, we'll try to collate them if we get several of the same type. And if we get to the end and we didn't get to your question, we'll be sure to provide a little extra time to ensure folks can re-enter their question if necessary. So now we'll look for some questions. So we do have the first question, that is, will there be a separate draft rule published with the draft EIS? The draft proposed rule is currently out for comment. The draft EIS will then be put out for public input, and based on that public input, there will be a final rule after the comment period on the draft proposed rule and the draft EIS. The second question is, will the slides be made available after this presentation? This presentation has been recorded and will be posted at the web page that the link was provided to, and you'll be able to listen to all of the webinars that are given on this topic, as they will all be available for your use in the future. Still waiting on new questions, so we'll just continue to see if anyone else would like to pose a question to us. So we do have another question. Are these proposed alternatives published, or will they be available with the draft EIS? So the draft EIS will be the analysis of the no action and the 3 action alternatives. So that's what the purpose of the EIS will be, is to analyze all of those alternatives and its impact on the environment per our NEPA requirements.
This is Ken Richgis, also with the Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm the chief for the Division of Migratory Bird Management. And just to follow up on that question, like I said, these alternatives that Eric just went over, these action alternatives are ones that we are planning on addressing in the draft EIS and doing analyses on. But also the purpose of this public scoping meeting today is for the public to not only provide comment on those proposed alternatives, but also potentially offer additional alternatives that we may have missed in our consideration here today. So if anyone not listening on the phone or members of the public, they could submit comments for us to take a look at additional alternatives. Okay, Okay, the next question, from the proposed alternatives, is there a preferred alternative yet? If so, which one? There is not a preferred alternative at this time. That'll become clearer once we complete the analyses as part of the NEPA process.
Thanks, Ken. All right, we'll continue to wait a few minutes to see if there's any additional questions. Thanks for those who have submitted questions to this point. So the next question that we received is, we understand you have received multiple requests to extend the current public comment periods. When do we anticipate responding to these requests? That is correct. We have received multiple requests. Those requests are being evaluated, and we hope to be responding to those requests very soon, likely this week. Still waiting for any last questions to be posed. So the question is, what types of biological information is the service planning to rely on in seeking to analyze impacts to birds in the EIS? And that's a good question. Some of the questions that we posed in the NOI get to some of that, looking at some of the economic benefits and or ecosystem services. As far as population information, we'll be relying on all sources that we can access. Breeding bird survey, Christmas bird count data, eBird data, whatever data sets are available to us that we need. Again, a lot of the information we're seeking, as far as ecosystem services, that's one of the main drivers we'd like to get from the public. But any information that's presented to us will be reviewed and incorporated as appropriate into the analysis. Again, thank you for these questions. We'll wait a few more minutes to see if there's more. The next question is, how is the availability of these webinars being communicated to the public? I believe we have announced these on social media. We do have the web page, which has the webinar information on that as well. As well as we did put this in the Federal Register notice. The next question is, will these proposed changes have any direct effect on farmers or agricultural producers? If so, how? I think it's unknown at this time. It will depend on the analysis. It depends on the alternative that is selected to move forward and what the proposed rule finally looks like. I think that's an unknown at this time.
Eric, there's a question that came through in the chat function that says, what will happen if the current challenge to the solicitor's memo is successful?
I'd like to turn that question over to one of the solicitors.
Yeah, this is Ken Richkus, also from the Fish and Wildlife Service again, Division of Migratory Bird Management, and I would invite one of our solicitors to speak on this. And I know at this point, I don't think the Fish and Wildlife Service wants to comment on pending litigation. And really today, the whole purpose of this public scoping webinar is, again, get comment on the purpose and need in the EIS, present some potential management alternatives that the public can respond to, as well as some of the additional economic and biological information that Eric went over that will help with the analysis. So that's really the need today. But for anyone from the solicitor's office, if you want to follow up or comment, speak up.
Yeah, this is Philip Klein with the Division of Parks and Wildlife. I think the only thing I would add is any effects it might have, on any industry would depend on the alternative that the service chooses. Under the current M opinion, that opinion interprets the statute as not applying to incidental take, so any types of agricultural activities that lead only to incidental take and not direct purposeful take of bird species would not be prohibited under the opinion. If the service codifies the opinion in a regulation that would, maintain that interpretation. So the effect would really depend on which alternative you look at.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, can the proposed changes be made without violating the terms of the treaties with the other 4 countries? I do know that we have been coordinating with the State Department over this. Again, I might refer this to the Solicitor's office to comment on this one.
Yeah, this is Philip again. I would just add that the M opinion itself, which is the basis of one of the alternatives being considered, and the proposed rule does lay out an analysis of the underlying conventions and how this interpretation is consistent with those underlying conventions. So I'd refer folks to that.
All right, thank you. We'll wait for a few more questions to come in. Give a couple other minutes here. If nothing else comes in, we'll go ahead and end the webinar. All right, I'm seeing no additional questions. I'll give another 30 seconds in case somebody's typing. And I do want to thank you for your participation today and invite you to submit public comments through the rulemaking portals that we've provided to you. And I'm not seeing any other questions. So at this time, I'm going to end the webinar. And again, once again, thank you and everyone here for putting this on. Thank you so much. Have a good day.